Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about size, or more specifically, limitations on size. Just as there are size limitations on amusement park rides, so too are there size limitations in the world of aviation. I guess technically speaking, there kind of isn't a limit so long as you combine adequate lift, power, and just space to use the thing, but practically speaking, engine power, runway sizes, weight, and structural stability all act as limiters on aircraft. And almost all of these limiters interconnect and play off of each other. If the weight of a plane is too great, then more or stronger engines could be added. However, engines are often only so powerful though, meaning that the absolute heaviest aircraft need multiple engines, and having multiple engines adds more weight. If adding engines isn't your speed, then perhaps you could generate more lift, with longer and wider wings. However, doing this also increases the weight, and the longer the wings are, the more that they need to be supported. This, in turn, adds even more weight. But if that's not enough, as the size of this hypothetical aircraft increases, so too does the size of the runway that it needs. And while this may seem like it's a simple task, in just getting a big old slab of concrete down, there would be a lot of work in leveling that area and maintaining the runway that's exposed to the elements. Then there's the financial incentive of making such a large runway for just one thing, and etc., etc., and etc. Simply put, there are a lot of reasons why the vast majority of planes don't go above the size of, like, jet airliners. At some point, it simply isn't worth it. But right now, we're thinking too big. We need to go smaller and older, and talk about size limitations on much smaller aircraft, specifically ones from World War II, because, well, that's what we talk about on this channel. Specifically, single-engine aircraft. On single-engine aircraft, the power of the singular engine is certainly a limiter, and back in the 30s and 40s, each country would have vastly different production capabilities, overall engine sizes, engine power, and preferred engine types. The greater production capabilities and standards that were seen in the United States would allow for bigger, stronger, and more complex engines, at least when compared to, say, the Soviet Union, or Italy, or Japan. And speaking of Japan, they're the subject of our video for today. Largely using lower power radial engines, this at least partially necessitated them using smaller and lighter aircraft. This would go hand in hand with their overall preference for lighter and more agile fighters. So if you were to guess what the limiting factor on a Japanese single-engine plane in World War II was, 9 times out of 10, you would probably guess that the engine played the greatest role. But no, our subject for today had a completely different limiter, one that was a bit less intuitive, but still important nonetheless. This is the heaviest and largest Japanese carrier-based aircraft that was used in World War II. This is the Aichi B7A Ryusei. To start, though, we have to go back over 2 decades before the start of World War II, around the end of the First World War, with Japan's decision to begin construction of an aircraft carrier, the world's first purpose-built commissioned aircraft carrier at that. Now, it wasn't the first purpose-built to begin or complete construction, though, and that honor goes to the British HMS Hermes, but it was the first to be commissioned, a key step. Beginning construction in 1920, the carrier Hosho, when completed in late 1921, and commissioned in late 1922, was a major step for Japan in their growth to being a major global power, come the mid to late 1930s. But at least when you compare it to other carriers from roughly around the same time, the Hosho was a very small carrier. As you can see from this image, the Hosho was the runt of the litter, being just above half the length of the USS Lexington that also began construction around 1920, and it was about half the width as well. Additionally, the Hosho could only carry about 15 aircraft, compared to the Lexington's over 70. Despite beginning construction around the same time, the Hosho was half the carrier with a quarter of the power. However, the Hosho, despite being classed as just an aircraft carrier, it was effectively a light carrier, and light carriers are generally smaller, it's kind of in the name. And Japan's next carrier, the Akagi, and subsequent carrier, the Kaga, placed their carriers on relatively equal footing with their future enemies, being similar in size and aircraft capacity. However, there was a pretty significant design difference between American and Japanese carriers, a difference that was probably pretty difficult to spot at first glance, but was still very important. The difference would be in the elevators used to transfer the aircraft from their hangars in the hull to the flight deck. As Japanese aircraft, on average, were smaller than their American counterparts, this largely meant that the elevators carrying these planes could be smaller as well. This would ideally mean that less time, effort, and resources needed to be spent on fashioning larger elevators that could carry greater weight. Comparing the Akagi to the USS Lexington, the size difference in their main elevators was pretty significant. On the Akagi, it would have two elevators. The larger main one was 11.8 by 13 meters, and the smaller one was 8.4 by 12.8 meters. On the USS Lexington, it would also have two elevators. The larger main one was 9.1 by 18.3 meters, and if needed, this could be extended by an additional 6.1 by 7.9 meter square section. Now, the second elevator on the Lexington was pretty small, at just 9.1 by 11 meters, but that main elevator was enormous, considering as well that aircraft on carriers were often fitted with folding wings that significantly reduced the wingspan. The American carrier would easily be able to carry far larger aircraft if needed. As Japan would continue constructing their carriers, their elevator sizes would increase, but only marginally, and nowhere near the maximum size that was offered by something like the Lexington. A carrier like the Shokaku, for example, its largest elevator was 13 by 16 meters, certainly an improvement, but not terribly large. Meanwhile, on subsequent American carriers, they would largely do away with the traditional elevators that were just a big hole in the flight deck, basically, and they would switch over to deck edge elevators, more compact, convenient, and probably better than just having a big hole in the flight deck. But then, in 1939, the Japanese Navy and military approved the Taiho carrier, that was to be fitted with slightly larger square elevators that were about 14 by 14 meters. As both it and the preceding carrier, the Hayo, had these slightly larger square elevators, it was clear that Japan was starting to shift over to having overall larger elevators that could carry larger aircraft in general. This then led to a call from the Japanese Navy in 1941, accompanied by Design Specification 16C, for a new carrier-based torpedo and dive bomber that would be replacing the Yokosuka D4Y, a plane that was actually still in development at the time, but was further along in development, the Nakajima B5N, and eventually the Nakajima B6N, that was being developed almost in parallel to this 16C design. However, the Navy believed that the 16C design would be better than what the B6N would be. They would specifically call for a plane with a bomb load around 1,100 pounds, or it would need the ability to carry one 1,800-pound torpedo, along with it needing an armament of 2 forward-firing 20mm cannons and 1 rear-firing machine gun. A top speed upwards of 354 miles an hour was also sought, with a maximum range upwards of 2,000 miles. Interestingly, as well, they wanted this design to be on par maneuverability-wise with the Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, a very tall task for what would shape up to be comparably a much larger aircraft. Additionally, as the carrier elevators were to be larger, the length of the design could be longer as well. Previously, Japanese carrier aircraft had an effective max length around 11 meters, and this can be seen in several designs that all sat either just under or just barely over 11 meters long. Japanese designers would stick to that limit very closely. For these overall requirements, the company Aichi began their design work, and rather early on in this process, the Japanese Navy would swoop in and add another requirement, as the plane was to be more versatile in that it needing to have the maneuverability of the Zero kinda basically implied that the design was also to be serving as a fighter if necessary. The engine on it would have to be quite powerful enough to achieve a high top speed with a full payload. For this, the Navy would tell Aichi that the engine their design would be using was the Nakajima Omare engine, which in 1941 was largely still in its prototype phase, still working through the initial design. The Navy would view the Homare engine as the effective successor to the Sakae engine that the Zero would use. So for this new, modern carrier aircraft, a new, more powerful engine would be required. By the end of World War II, the Homare engine would be among the most powerful engines Japan had at their disposal, but in 1941, that certainly was not the case yet. Still though, with the potential power it held, the eventual design from Aichi would certainly be promising. By May 1942, Aichi would have their first prototype for their AM-23 design ready to take to the air. Measuring in at 11.49 meters long, still not going up too far above that old 11-meter limit, 14.4 meters wide, and 4.08 meters tall, the AM-23, also called the B7A by the Japanese Navy, was pretty large as Japanese carrier aircraft are concerned. Compared to the Zero, it was 2.5 meters longer and 2.5 meters wider. Compared to the B5N, it was about a meter longer, but also a meter narrower. Compared to the B6N, it was roughly the same size, slightly longer and slightly narrower. And compared to the D4Y, it was a meter longer and almost 3 meters wider. Size-wise, the B7A was just barely the older brother of the group, but where the size would stand out even more, though, was in its weight. With a full bomb load, the B7A would have a gross weight of 12,401 pounds. This compared to just 6,146 pounds on the Zero, 8,378 pounds on the B5N, 11,464 on the B6N, and 9,370 on the D4Y. Keep in mind as well that the B7A was, as per the requested specs, to be as agile as the Zero, despite weighing twice as much. If Aichi could pull that off, the Japanese Navy would have a monstrously overqualified torpedo and dive bomber at their disposal. For the rest of the initial prototype design, it would feature inverted gull wings, much like the F4U Corsair and Ju-87 Stuka. This was done to ensure that there was enough space for an under-fuselage torpedo, and to ensure that its larger propeller didn't hit the ground. Now, they could have just made the legs longer in that case, but that would also require the legs to be reinforced further, and thus heavier and bulkier, so they went with the gull wings instead. The cockpit of the B-7A was extended, as is often the case for torpedo bombers, to ensure greater vision for all crew. In the B-7A's case, their crew of 2. The tail and tail surfaces on it were pretty much standard, with a more mid-set horizontal surface. Other than that, there isn't terribly much else of major note. When the B-7A took to the air starting in May 1942, it had some very high expectations to meet, and at least at times, it would actually manage to meet said expectations. In the best case scenarios, the top speed of the B-7A not only met these expectations, but actually exceeded them, going past the requested top speed of 354 miles an hour and up to 367 miles an hour, and the handling at this speed was reportedly exceptional. While I'm not 100% sure if this top speed was achieved with a full bomb or torpedo load, I do strongly suspect it was achieved without any payload at all, but still such a speed for such a heavy carrier-based aircraft by Japan standards was very impressive. After dropping its payload, such a top speed would be incredibly beneficial in ensuring its survival on the trip back to base. For the plane's true top speed, or more likely the top speed with a payload, it would drop, albeit not by that much, down to 351 miles an hour. Even with this top speed drop, its top speed would actually still be greater than early versions of the Zero, and roughly on par with late war variants of the Zero. It would also be over 100 miles an hour faster than the B5N, 50 miles an hour faster than the B6N, and 10 miles an hour faster than the D4Y. Faster than the 2 planes it would replace, faster than the plane it was intended to replace later on, and even faster than Japan's main carrier-based fighter. Not only was it faster than the Zero, but in its maneuverability testing, it was found to be just about as agile as well. Overall, in its initial performance and potential versatility, the B-7A was not only a worthy successor as a dive and torpedo bomber, but perhaps even as a fighter as well. But do recall how I said that it met expectations at times. This was because of the Homare engine still being quite early in its development in May 1942, and despite being projected to output 1600 to 1800 horsepower, it rarely would ever achieve that, and the more common performance early on was roughly on par with the stronger model Nakajima Sakae engines that it was made to replace. With this inferior level of performance, the B-7A would not be a viable aircraft unless maybe it shed a lot of its weight. So, barring that, it would basically have to wait until the Homare engine was consistent enough to begin its full production run, and the B-7A would have to wait quite a while. It wouldn't be until May 1944, 2 years after the first flight date, that the Homare engine was viewed as being sufficient enough for production. But now, with a proper engine ready to go, the B-7A could be off to the races. By this time as well, just 2 months prior, the Taiho carrier it was designed for was officially commissioned and was ready for combat. Aichi just needed to produce 30 to 40 B-7As, and the Taiho could be sufficiently outfitted with its dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters for some carrier-to-carrier combat. However, for some reason that I couldn't find an answer to, Aichi was never able to ramp up production for the B-7A. Its production would only really begin increasing around September 1944, and even then the number produced per month was just a handful, and by the end of 1944, including the prototypes made, just 41 had been made in total. it wasn't until early 1945 that production per month even hit double digits. But still, better late than never. Japan was on the ropes, and a plane like the B-7A flying from Japanese carriers would certainly be a significant boost. Only there was one very small problem. By June 1944, the carrier Taiho was, well, at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. It was a rather embarrassing end for the Taiho in that battle. After launching some of its aircraft, those being Zeros, D4Ys, and B6Ns, the Taiho was struck by a single torpedo from the USS Albacore, with a combination of excellent torpedo placement in that it struck some fuel storage, and a very poor response from the sailors on board that would fail to put out the fires and drain away flooding. The Taiho would sink, with over 1,500 crew going down with it. Not only did this reduce an ever-dwindling Japanese fleet, but it left the B-7A without a place to call home. None of the remaining Japanese carriers would have elevators large or strong enough to move the B-7A. Except then in November 1944, the carrier Shinano was finished with its construction, and with a main elevator that was 14 by 15 meters, it was large and strong enough to hold the B-7A. For about 10 days or so, anyway, as just 10 days after that carrier was complete, it too was sunk by an American submarine attack. Once again, the B-7A was left without a home. Now having no home once again, the existing B-7As were forced to operate as land-based aircraft, alongside comparatively much better aircraft like the Ki-84 and Shiden. As they numbered less than 100 at the beginning of 1945, their overall impact in this role was incredibly limited, and in fact they basically made no impact. Production would continue though, although never actually producing more than 15 in a single month across 2 factories. Past May 1945, the production of the B-7A effectively ended, after an earthquake destroyed the bulk of the main factory that was producing it. This earthquake would also quash any plans to improve upon the B-7A, as some initial designing was in the works to fit it with a Mitsubishi Mk9A engine with around 2,200 horsepower, a 400 or so horsepower boost over the B-7A's current engine. This engine was also dimensionally larger and a little bit heavier, so this would have required some redesigning of the nose and cowling, but this redesigning never actually left paper. Overall, though, the Aichi B7A Ryusei was one of the more unfortunate aircraft in World War II. While it certainly went through its trials and tribulations, with extensive delays due to issues with the engine, it ended up being a really promising aircraft that if it was just a few months ahead of schedule, it may have been able to make some kind of impact in World War II. Not exactly enough to change the course of the war or anything, but enough to give American and various Allied fighters a solid scare, with this sort of tank-ish Zero-esque plane buzzing around. But because it was slightly too large for older Japanese carriers, it was a plane without a home. When it was finally ready for combat, it was basically like that one image from Community, a show I've never seen, but I do know the meme, where Donald Glover comes in with the pizza and the room's on fire. The B-7A is the Donald Glover of World War II. Take that for what you will. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. There is something else about the B7A that I just thought of at the end of writing this. With how the cowling kinda sloped down from the slope of the cockpit canopy and general nose section, it kinda looks like a plecostomus or some kind of bottom-feeding fish. I have a plecostomus in my fish tank. It's a albino bristlenose plecostomus. and it hangs around inside this fake wooden log all day. It only comes out at night, and then as soon as I turn on the light, it runs away. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.